Hey guys, week 16 is in the books, and the second round of the fantasy playoffs for the inaugural season of the League of Ordinary Jabronis is over. So we'll get into what the matchups for next week will look like for the championship. But before I wanted to get started, I wanted to wish everyone a happy holidays. I'm pretty sure everybody in the league celebrates Christmas, so I assume that's what everyone was doing this weekend. It's just going to be me today. Everyone is either out doing stuff with friends or probably still celebrating Christmas or something, hanging out with family. I'm a degenerate fantasy football player, so here I am on the day after Christmas recording the podcast for everybody to enjoy. I think it's going to be a little bit abbreviated this week just because of, I'm the only one here and my takes can only carry us so far. So, yeah. But it's looking like we have a matchup between Jordan and Joe. Congratulations to you two for making it into the championship round, barring a stat correction in Danny and Jordan's matchup. But let's take a look at how things broke down this week, starting with Trevor and Joe's matchup. Heartbreaker for Trevor, obviously. The first round bye just didn't really matter in this case, unfortunately, when you have an opponent that plays multiple players that have career days, Amari Cooper being the big one. It's like years past, we had the, what was it called? The Jamalacost. We had the Kamara Geddon game. And I'm sure there's more. I just can't remember off the top of my head all of the matches where there's a player that just goes absolutely crazy during the playoffs. But this is where the term league winner comes from. You have players that just have all of their impact in one day, and that decides the season for you. And yeah, this game is ultimately a game of luck. The skill of scouting players and drafting can only carry you so far because, once you get into the playoffs, the more so than the rest of the season, it's a matter of, how the cards fall. It's ultimately it's informed gambling is what we're dealing with here. And yeah, them's the breaks, man. So looking at the matchups here, quarterback to quarterback matchup here, Brock Purdy really struggled in this game. And under the brightest stage, he just didn't have it. Arguably, the situation with the offensive line really hampered his ability to really distribute the ball, and there were several injuries in this game. He ended up getting benched for Sam Darnold of all people. But yeah, throwing 4 interceptions just isn't good enough. And it pretty much limited the rest of the receiving options for San Francisco as well throughout this game, but not Christian McCaffrey, as we'll talk about later. Yeah, so really rough game for Brock Purdy. On the other end of it, Lamar Jackson was fantastic. He played really, really well. The Ravens look pretty much unbeatable at this point, and by all metrics are a favorite to win the Super Bowl this season. So that's going to be an interesting matchup in the playoffs if they end up squaring off later on. Baker Mayfield, I don't know what's going on with Jacksonville, man. It is a absolutely crazy situation. The last 4 games, I think the Jacksonville Jaguars are on a 4-game losing streak, which is spelling kind of a death knell. Like nobody in their division really wants to win any games. It seems like there were no wins for them in that division. So on the other side, though, obviously you have Baker Mayfield, who second week in a row looks legitimate. I mean, he is just feeding Mike Evans. He's making everything of his opportunity that he's been given down in Tampa Bay, and he's doing a great job. I don't know where the Browns went wrong getting rid of him as quickly as they did. But we've talked about it before on this podcast. It just doesn't make any sense what the Browns organization is doing at the quarterback position, because they had a guy that was perfectly fine who got them to the playoffs and even got their first playoff win in a really, really long time. But they wanted to move on, and they wanted to do it with Deshaun Watson of all people, and that's where we're at. Austin Eckler has been brutal, and Easton Stick really isn't doing him any favors. The situation with Justin Herbert getting injured with his finger surgery, and the fact that Austin Eckler has been playing hurt all season has really impacted his fantasy viability. The last couple seasons, he's just been absolutely lights out. But for this season, he's just not the same guy. I mean, from a fantasy standpoint, I think he's still going to carry value next year and going forward, just because of the type of player that he is. He's agile, he's flexible, he's fast, and he's a very adept pass catcher, which even in a scaled back role will maintain some value. We may have seen the peak of Austin Eckler in terms of his fantasy RB1 role, but going forward, I think it's safe to say that Austin Eckler will still be a fantasy viable player and will have a lot of value going forward. I'm a big fan of Austin Eckler personally. He's also very friendly to fantasy football, so probably more so than any other player in the league, I would say, because of his engagement with the fantasy football community and the fact that he does his own podcast that's centered around fantasy football content. He understands that he's like a legacy player at this point when it comes to the running back position because of how valuable he's been. He's been the CMCs of past, and he's up there with CMC every year. So, yeah. James Cook started the game. He looked really explosive to begin, but ended up, 20 carries is what you want to see from your player. But this just ended up being a defensive slog between the Chargers and Buffalo. And I'll be honest, I didn't watch this game live because I believe this was the game that was Peacock only. So I had to catch the condensed version on NFL Plus afterwards. And it was, like I mentioned, with the issues with Austin Eckler, is Easton Stick just being who he was, and just Josh Allen played well. I mean, he got a rushing touchdown and threw 2 passing touchdowns, but the play for James Cook has really been force feeding him the ball, and he's shown flashes. He ended up fumbling twice in this game, which is rough, and affected his fantasy output. But ultimately, not too worried about him going forward. I do think that he's going to be utilized very heavily next week, which Joe's going to need in order to beat Jordan, potentially. So on the other end, you had Alvin Kamara, who the New Orleans Saints, man, it's just a really rough watch. And they played against a team in the Rams who have a very effective run defense. So there's not a lot that you can really expect from a running back on an offense that struggles to move the ball. But you really want more than 7 points in this game. Trevor definitely was looking for that kind of a performance from Alvin, just like a couple years back when he had his own Amari Cooper-like performance and scored 5 touchdowns in a game in Week 16. Go figure. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Jahmyr Gibbs' usage after like Week 7 or so has skyrocketed, and I think he's been a top 5 running back since that point. And it looking like he's going to be a really good option for Detroit, especially going into the playoffs. They're going to need him. So everyone's going to be watching Jahmyr Gibbs and his usage in their playoff match that they end up, after they end up clinching the division for the first time in 40 years. So congrats to the Lions for doing that. This season has been crazy and pretty brutal to watch, but if there's anything that we can take away from it, the Lions finally finding some success is really exciting to watch. So yeah, congrats to them for getting into the playoffs and with a decent seed at that. That's incredible. Puka Nacua has completely taken over that role that Cooper Kupp used to have on that offense in the Rams. He looks incredible, man. This was arguably the steal of the draft this season, and Trevor desperately needs these kind of guys with his aging vets. He's still got some gas in the tank. I think Trevor's got a lot of players that will be relevant for quite a while, but it's going to be probably every year he'll be dealing with a player that falls off that he'll have to either supplant with either a trade or some moves in the draft. But Puka Nacua has definitely solidified himself in the fantasy sphere this season. He was on that historic tear to begin the season and is over 1,300 receiving yards and has 5 touchdowns for his rookie season. That is incredible for a rookie wide receiver drafted in, I think it was the 5th or 6th round, that has exploded onto the scene and is really giving Matthew Stafford's career a second wind, because coming into this season, it was kind of, will Matthew Stafford be anything this season because of the injury last year that made it so that he couldn't play? And he showed that he definitely has a couple, maybe even 3-4 years left in the tank playing as a top-level quarterback for the Rams. And I think he's a legitimate candidate to win Comeback Player of the Year this season. I think that would make sense, given the situation that the Rams were in going into the season, where it was kind of the Rams tanking conversation, and no one really was looking at them in the NFC West as an actual contender. And here they are, positioned for playoffs. And Puka Nacua is definitely leading the charge in that respect. He's along with the situation that they've had to deal with at running back, with Cam Akers being traded away and Kyron Williams kind of coming out of nowhere and being the guy for their backfield. It's been interesting to watch Sean McVay work his magic, because it's something that doesn't happen that often in the NFL, where you have a team that's kind of really in the spotlight in the national media just be kind of the underdog and actually come forth as a juggernaut almost. Like the Rams actually look pretty competent. Granted, they did face a relatively soft opponent in one of the worst divisions in football in the Saints. They look like they're positioned for a pretty interesting playoff run potentially. I haven't looked too much into the analytics of the seeding and everything relating to every team that's in the hunt in the NFC, but it's something that we'll have to keep an eye on going forward for sure. AJ Brown kind of had a meh game. Jalen Hurts really struggled against the Giants. I know that the Giants have a pretty formidable defensive line, but overall, over the last probably 5 weeks, I would say, Jalen Hurts hasn't really looked like the guy that he was showing himself to be last year, and he's definitely regressed a lot. But I think the biggest issue with the Eagles is their defense has completely fallen apart. They fired Sean Desai, their defensive coordinator, and are rolling with a new guy. And they, I think it's Matt Patricia actually, and which is ironic because him and Darius Slay are not on good terms. At least they weren't when I believe he was with the Lions. But yeah, they got to figure something out. That team, in my opinion, got robbed of a Lombardi trophy last season due to a ticky-tack holding call that the refs decided to make. And now that's kind of given them a chip on their shoulder, and we'll have to see how they react to the last couple games in the season. Are they conserving their power for the playoffs, or is this their true colors? Are they going to be struggling like this going forward? I know they ended up scoring 33 points in this game, but you watch the game, and Jalen Hurts really doesn't pass the eye test. There was that moment in the game where the Philly fans were booing a run play because they weren't rolling with Jalen, and there's just the energy around the Eagles is just so strange this year. We'll see what happens with them. DK Metcalf had yet again another incredible highlight touchdown catch that in real time looked like he stepped out of bounds. But again, DK, elite wide receiver, was able to make the grab and salvage his day from a fantasy perspective at least. The Seahawks offense was pretty rough to watch in this one, but at this point, DK Metcalf has got a highlight reel from just this season of just clutch touchdowns, and you love to see it as a Seahawks fan. Myself, it's really great to see the physical specimen that DK is be able to get it done week in, week out. He's also clearly had a change of attitude. I've noticed that there's less antics ever since I think week 3 or 4, when there was all the talk about DK being a hothead and costing his team games and everything, which I don't necessarily agree with. There was one penalty he pulled early in the season, which I thought was really egregious. But other than that, there's been a lot of discourse around specific things that DK has been doing that people have been saying has been bringing the team down. But I've noticed that he's really cooled off and is very focused, and that makes a very scary player. Hopefully Geno Smith or Drew Lock, whoever the Seahawks end up going with going forward, can figure it out. And hopefully DK stays with the Seahawks and doesn't get traded or anything like that, because they need him. They need the alpha wide receiver that he is. And I would hate to see him traded away and have him play against my team and just watch him make highlight play after highlight play with a competent quarterback, because that would be just so brutal to watch. And then Amari Cooper with the historic game, 11 for 15 receiving, 265 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a 2-point conversion with 9 receiving first downs. Incredible performance by Amari Cooper. Joe Flacco has just been slinging the ball the last couple weeks that he's been starting for the Browns, and you really kind of got to wonder both what happened with the Jets, because he was in their system and they needed a backup quarterback, and they knew who Zach Wilson is, and they let Joe Flacco go. And then conversely, on the other side, you got the Browns with Joe Flacco just absolutely looking much better than Deshaun Watson at this point. And he's way older than him. And it's like, what is going on with the Browns? This was a game of the ages, probably one of the most infamous plays in fantasy. I know Trevor got knocked out by a team with Amari Cooper in another league, which is incredibly frustrating. I definitely feel for him on that one. But it happens. Amari Cooper just had this is the kind of player that he is. It's amazing that he's had 200 plus receiving games with 3 different teams. He played on the Raiders. He had a game like this. He played with Dallas Cowboys. He had a game like this. And then now with the Browns, he's had another game like this. This is just who Amari Cooper is. He used to be kind of the Gabe Davis type of guy before Gabe Davis was the Gabe Davis meme that we know who he is today. It was, you never knew when to play Amari Cooper, but he always had the talent. You knew that he had the ceiling that he showed this week, but it was really inconsistent, and he would either have no points or a lot of points. And this week, And this season, really, he's been pretty solid. I mean, he's had several really bad games where he definitely hurt you, but generally he's been a good play. It just so happens that in his 8th season, he is sending certain teams to fantasy Super Bowls because that kind of performance is special. And it pretty much won Joe the week, just having Amari Cooper. Other than that, that's pretty much all of the offensive players that contributed in these games that were started. I already mentioned Joe Flacco. That was on Joe's bench, though. But from the tight end perspective, you had Jake Ferguson, Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce has... Are we seeing the end of Travis Kelce, or is this just a down year? He is 34, going on 35 next season. Next season will be his 11th year in the NFL if he doesn't retire in the offseason. But we've mentioned it several times, and we've talked about it ad nauseum this season. Kansas City Chiefs just don't look right now. Their offense looks completely broken. They lost to a Aiden O'Connell-led Vegas Raiders team, a divisional matchup, where Aiden O'Connell threw for, I think, 68 yards in the first quarter and then proceeded to not complete a pass for 3 consecutive quarters. 0 passing yards for 0 catches, no offensive production from the quarterback position for 3 quarters, and they ended up beating the Chiefs 20-14. That is a feat. That is an absolute feat. Isaiah Pacheco was good. He ended up getting injured, however. He got a gnarly concussion. Was taken out of the game, and now it's looking like Clyde Edwards-Helaire will be the running back to start next week. So Joe is going to have some interesting decisions to make at his flex spot. Chuba Hubbard salvaged his day against Green Bay in a very interesting match between the Carolina Panthers and the Green Bay Packers. The end of the game was pretty contentious with, I think it was a Dontavian Wicks catch that wasn't a catch that ended up kind of sealing the game for Green Bay in a way. But Chuba Hubbard was decent. He was rough halfway through the game, but he ended up getting a touchdown to salvage the day. Joe Mixon took a really tough L against Steelers, who had a George Pickens blow-up game on the other end. Cincinnati ends up losing this 11-34 and got absolutely crushed by Pittsburgh, who are fighting for playoffs at the moment. Although so are the Bengals. This was a tough loss for them. Joe Mixon was really stifled on the ground. They were playing from behind most of the game, so there wasn't really a whole lot that could be done on the ground. On the other side, though, Aaron Jones was looking like Aaron Jones of old. Hopefully that holds true for the rest of the season. You really want to see guys like Aaron Jones succeed, especially with A.J. Dillon in the wings, not really putting up anything. Green Bay desperately needs a functioning run game in order to control the game offensively and take pressure off Jordan Love. So that's good to see. And then all the defensive plays from both teams were really solid. Trevor made a play with Ernest Jones, who kind of really has come into his own the last couple weeks. He's on a sack streak, 3 in a row. Best game of the season this week with 27 points. Boye Mafe on the other side, very productive, 2 sacks. Head-to-head matchup between those two linebackers was, Boye Mafe is a defensive lineman, but he was playing like a linebacker in this game. He was kind of a monster. But yeah, this was a fun one to watch. TJ Watt did pretty much everything that he needed to do defensively. He got his sack. He got his forced fumble. He got a pass defense. He was hitting the quarterback over and over. This dude is just a monster. And like Trevor says, it's his whole defense. Although he had a couple other good players that contributed this week. Quinton Williams, floor game. Montez Sweat got that pass breakup. Now, Christian Wilkins, this one, Trevor really needed more from him. This was going into a game in the evening where Amari Cooper had done his damage, and Trevor was really looking for some production from his players. And fortunately, he just didn't get it from Christian Wilson. Montez Sweat, Roquan Smith, I already said Montez Sweat. Roquan Smith was surprisingly quiet in a game where he was really active. I mean, he got 8 tackles, but no big splash plays this week. Logan Wilson was a tackling monster as usual. He got a pass breakup. And floor games from Travarius Ward and Kevin Byard on Trevor's side were pushed out by a incredible effort by Brian Branch, who yet again was absolutely all over Minnesota. Ended up pulling out a win against them in that game, getting a sack, forced fumble, interception, an additional pass breakup, and 6 tackles. This dude is a dog. Brian Branch is an incredible defensive back. That's all she wrote for the matchup between Trevor and Joe. I think it's safe to say that a stat correction won't save Trevor's season, but he closed it out with a nice, even 180 points, at least. It's that's something, I guess. The OCD can't be triggered there, but man, I think Joe had an incredible week. He just ran up against a buzzsaw. Nothing more you can do there. And then on the other side, we had a really exciting matchup between Danny and Jordan. So it ended up being Danny falling to Jordan 176-36 and Jordan 178.12, I should say. The stat correction situation is absolutely in full effect here. So we have to keep an eye on that. If there is a stat correction by Thursday and this ends up flipping, we'll mention it in the podcast for next week. But that is a really thin margin. I would be sweating if I was Jordan. And Danny is praying for a pass breakup to get corrected in his favor or something. A sack turning into half a sack for Jordan. It's so close between these two teams, and it was really exciting to watch. It really came down to that final game of the week, the Niners game versus Baltimore in the evening on Monday. These teams were going neck and neck. I just want to shout out Kyle Hamilton. Did everything that he could do to try and win Danny or get Danny to his first championship, but it ended up just not being enough. But Kyle Hamilton, man, shout out to him. He was really solid in this game. Really, really fun to watch this dude play football. It's a lot of teams kind of beating themselves up over not picking him. The Baltimore defense is super scary. And like I mentioned earlier, I think that it's going to be any game with the Ravens in the playoffs is going to be an incredible game to watch. One for the ages, for sure. Rayshon Jenkins, floor game. L'Jarius Sneed did nothing. Kansas City, like I mentioned earlier, seems pretty broken. Zaire Franklin was a beast in this game. He got 12 tackles and a pass breakup. He was all over the place, unfortunately. The Colts just couldn't get it done against Atlanta, who ran all over them. Bijan Robinson finally doing something after being really, really disappointing last week. And it's kind of similar thing with Breece Hall. Last week, nothing. This week, fantasy gold. So much production from those two guys after an absolute stinker last week. I don't think if you had either of those guys that and you were in playoffs, you made it to this point where you could actually take advantage of them. CJ Mosley, floor game. Max Crosby finally muted in a season where he's been playing hurt the entire time. His leg ballooned up, super, super big, full of fluid, and he's playing through it at a high level. It's incredible. But, yeah, he was a big part of the win, though. He was absorbing a lot of blocks and was doing better for real-life football than he was really for fantasy because he didn't really get to the quarterback. He had 2 hits, but no sacks this week. Gregor So had a floor game. Myles Garrett, though. Danny really, really needed Myles Garrett to show out this week, and he didn't. Myles Garrett, just 3 tackles. It's hard to say exactly what's going on, but it could be injury. He has been really banged up to end the season. He's still, by our fantasy scoring metrics, the top defensive end player. But ever since week 13, after the Golden Goose event, he has been pretty bad for fantasy, and that's concerning. Hopefully next season he can have a season like this one. I think he can because of the talent that he is. Myles Garrett is one of the best defensive players now, if not all time. We'll see how his career plays out. He's still very young, 27 for a defensive end. He's got a lot of gas in the tank. He could play for another 5-6 years easily and produce at this level. So, yeah, Cleveland's got a good player in Myles Garrett for sure. Forrest Buckner, he got bailed out with the pass defense, but again, just like Zaire, he was pretty irrelevant. The Colts offense was just broken without Michael Pittman Jr. and the lack of a run game. Ultimately, couldn't really get anything done, unfortunately. Alex Anelzone did nothing. The anal zone didn't get it done. Danny's Alex Singleton play was certainly interesting. He picked him up really, really late in the draft, but it mattered through down the stretch. Early on to start the season, he was not really getting much. He was getting a lot of tackles, but no splash plays, which obviously what we reward. But ever since the bye, he's been very good. And this dude almost was the difference this week for Danny. Denver had a really cursed game, though, against New England. They ended up falling to the Patriots 23-26. Yeah, that was a brutal watch. I wouldn't recommend watching it again. If I had to, I wouldn't. DeAndre Swift, he had 20 carries, 92 yards, and a touchdown. Like I mentioned earlier, against the Giants, the Eagles pretty much just reverted the ground game, and they didn't really let Jalen Hurts cook. They just managed the clock just like they needed to, and they had to basically outscore their defense in this game. It's like I was saying earlier, it's kind of scary when a team as bad as the New York Giants make it a game like they did. You got to kind of pause, and we'll see what happens to the Eagles in the playoffs. Tyjae Spears, like I've mentioned before on the podcast, I think he's the heir apparent to the running back 1 role in Tennessee. They clearly had a plan coming into this game against Seattle, and that was to run the ball as much as they could, regardless of the score. And that's what they did. Derrick Henry was effective in this game, even throwing a touchdown pass to Chico, which was such a weird play. I thought it was, I didn't recognize that it was Derrick Henry throwing the ball when that play happened, and it looked like he fell down, but then I realized, oh, it's just that really big dude throwing a pass again. Jesus. But yeah, a rushing touchdown for Derrick Henry, and then Tyjae Spears by himself getting 11.2 points, eking out 9 carries, was effective too, just under 4 yards a carry, and lots of receiving work, which is really good to see when it comes to fantasy running backs. You want to see your running back get as many receptions as possible because of that PPR bonus. But I thought Tyjae Spears has been very effective as a running back, and I'm excited to see what happens to him next year. It'll be very interesting to see what happens to him next year in the context of what happens with Derrick Henry, whether he decides to stay or if he ends up with a new team will be one of the things to watch for the offseason for sure. Jerry Jeudy was not the play, unfortunately. Like I said earlier, cursed game. It's the Patriots. They limit your best weapon. Arguably, Jerry Jeudy is their best weapon. Courtland Sutton is a fantastic football player, but is he in this offense? I think Courtland Sutton might need a change of scenery to really unlock his potential. He flashed potential before Jeudy was around, but now that Judy's here and they're kind of doing this wide receiver by committee thing, there's certainly a hierarchy. But next season, it would be interesting to see what happens to Jerry, just like Tyjae. We hope that Jerry Jeudy can get it figured out. He was very talented in college, and so far that hasn't really panned out to the pros, but here we are. Sorry, Danny. I think Jerry Jeudy was ultimately the nail in the coffin for you. I mean, you had a couple other options that you could have gone with, but I can see you had a lot of difficult decisions that you had to make for your start sit this week. I mean, do you trust Noah Brown after giving you some seriously amazing weeks and beating me as a result one week because of him? It's hard to go with someone who gives you, I think, two goose eggs in a row? Yeah. And in playoffs, that's hard to do. Definitely hard to do. Cooper Kupp, like I mentioned earlier, the situation with Puka Nacua is definitely damaging Cooper Kupp's value. He also started the season slow because of the injury that he had during the offseason. And he just doesn't look the same. Not necessarily a top option next year. Like in redraft, I don't think he'll be going in the first round again. But he definitely will have some value. And I think that he'll be a mainstay in your team until he retires. I mean, he's getting up there. He's 30 years old. But he's a very, very good player. So he can be like a DeAndre Hopkins kind of guy that just sticks around. Maybe he goes to another team as a wide receiver one. Like, say he goes to Carolina and plays with Bryce Young, and hopefully they get an offensive line, then we might see a resurgence of Cooper Kupp. Maybe we even see it next year, and they do this 1A, 1B thing with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. But, yeah. Gerald Everett, 7 for 8. You love to see that with a tight end. Easton Stick is not amazing at football. He's definitely a backup, so he kind of needs that safety valve, middle of the field option, the short route stuff, which Gerald Everett excels in. So, unfortunately, he didn't get a touchdown for you, but that's pretty good output from a tight end. Jordan was in an interesting position playing two tight ends, T.J. Hawkinson and Isaiah Likely, in in a situation where you can get to the playoffs, or rather you get to your championship, is certainly a move. That takes balls. I commend you for that, Jordan, for playing Likely and Hawkinson. But Likely's looked fine. Like, he's been a good receiving option for Baltimore, so I don't hate the play. You clearly also are dealing with your own injuries, so whoever, if the sack correction doesn't happen, then you and Joe will be making some tough decisions next week for sure. TJ Hawkinson and Jordan Addison pretty much went out at the same time in this game. TJ Hawkinson's looking like his injury is pretty serious. He might be done for the season. I'm not sure of the actual details of his injury. Let me just check his player card. Oh, that's not good. He has a torn ACL and a torn MCL. So never mind. He's done. He will be done probably for a long time next year as well. Probably won't be fantasy relevant next year. It takes about a year and a half to complete the surgery, the healing process, and then also gain confidence in that knee again before we see players really return to who they were pre-injury. It's rare that you see players come back and look fantastic off of an ACL tear. So that's unfortunate. But that's fantasy. Jordan Addison is day to day with his injury, but he ended up getting knocked out with T.J. Hawkinson in the same drive, or very close time wise, which was interesting to watch while watching the scores between Jordan and Danny this week. I saw Jordan Addison go out, and then it was like, oh man, that's huge because Jordan Addison is kind of needs to get something done here for Danny, unless one of Jordan's guys also underperforms somehow, and it ended up TJ Hawkinson being that guy. It was like blow for blow. Kind of watching that. Amon-Ra St. Brown was incredible against Minnesota. Big factor in their win. Jackson Smith and Jigba again, clutch. Big part of his team's win for sure. Devon Achane had some opportunities this week. He should have got a lot more done than what he did get done, but unfortunately it just wasn't there. Very inefficient on the ground, but kind of like Ken Walker, you don't care about that inefficiency. You just need him to break away for a huge touchdown run or something to. And that's why you play him. You don't play him for the floor. You play him for the ceiling. And that's who he's shown himself to be. And that's probably what he will be for his entire career because he's so small. Rachaad White has been one of the best running backs in football and fantasy by extension. And he's going to be desperately needed by Jordan next week. So hopefully he can repeat this performance for you, Jordan. If not, I don't know. Joe's got some pretty good running backs to play against you. So you're going to need your boy Rachaad. He's been a good pick for you this season for sure. Christian McCaffrey is inevitable. He just seems like the player that is just going to win teams championships this season. He is the league winner. When people say league winner, they're talking about players like CMC that regardless of what's going on in the game, regardless of your quarterback throwing 4 interceptions and being absolutely terrible and getting benched for Sam Darnold, you're still getting 25 fantasy points from him. Insane season from Christian McCaffrey, especially with the injury history and the age. That trade revitalized his career, gave him, a second wind, and yeah, we'll see if he can do it for you again in the championship. But yeah, special player for sure. And then finally, we have the quarterback show off Russell Wilson versus Josh Allen, who both were pretty similar in terms of their performances, but Josh Allen was, I think, better, despite the fact that the Denver Broncos ended up falling to the Patriots. It was just Russell Wilson's fumbles and just there were just gaffes in that game that ended up losing them that one. But I guess you could say the same for the Chargers, where they just chargered themselves again, choked away a win, just couldn't get it done, not clutch. They need Justin Herbert back bad, man. But Josh Allen, pretty low passing volume from him this week. He ended up getting the rushing touchdown, which he really needed. He threw his characteristic interception like usual, but it didn't really end up mattering. Big performance from both of the starting quarterbacks this week. And it'll be interesting to see what decisions are made at quarterback going into next week because, it's looking like you got a choice of Gardner Minshew or Russell Wilson to pick from because Tommy DeVito, he won't be starting. So, yeah. Anyway, like I said earlier, if there is a stat correction between Danny and Jordan in their matchup, it will affect who ends up in the fantasy championship. So if that ends up coming to pass, we'll talk about it next week on the podcast. But as of now, before the stat corrections are in, we have Danny falling by 2 points to Jordan. Huge effort from you this year, Danny. I commend you. I think that you did an amazing job coming into a really challenging fantasy format and prospering. I think you've done a fantastic job and really happy to have you in the league, man. Hope you stick with it. You have a good team. I think you can push for the cup, the belt, any year with the roster you got. As long as you stay with it and keep making moves, you'll be good. So, that's all she wrote. I hope everyone had a great family time, holiday time, and I hope you have a safe New Year's. I'm going to be at the game, the Seahawks game on Sunday with Trevor. So I won't be watching all the games as closely, but I'll definitely follow up and I'll watch the condensed plays and things like that. So I'll have some information to give you guys, some takes on Tuesday after the championship is over. And then we can finally transition to the off season and experience that as a league. So hope everyone is doing good and we'll talk to you next week. And as always, defense wins championships and Steve sucks.